Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the One Health Academy. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. And it's great to see so many people join us. So my name is Blair Budd, and as the director of the One Health Academy, I'd like to sincerely thank you for joining us tonight. And we really miss seeing you all in person, but are definitely grateful that you decided to join us from potentially the comfort of your own home while we continue to meet remotely. So as always, I want to make sure to thank the One Health Commission for sponsoring our webinar access tonight, as well as the American Society of Microbiology for hosting us when we do meet in person. So thank you especially to those two groups, and ask if you guys would consider supporting them if you're able anyway. We'd really appreciate it. But I'll go ahead and move on. Before we get started with our talk, I'd like to cover some of the details about the next hour together, especially for those of you that are new and joining us for the first time. So welcome for those, and welcome back for those who are old timers. And we'll first start tonight. I'll introduce our speaker, and then I'll pass over the control to her, and we have anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes of the presentation. And then the remainder of the time that we have left will be for Q&A. And to ask your questions, please use the question feature of our GoToWebinar platform. And I know that can be a little confusing because there is a chat feature, but to keep all your questions organized into one place, we just ask that you please type your questions in the questions section. And yeah, we're about 3 or 4 minutes after right now, so hope that I've gotten all the laundry list of items out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and start to introduce our speaker for tonight, whom you're seeing also on the video cam. Tonight's talk, Healthy Plants Necessary for a Balanced One Health Concept, will be given by Dr. Jacqueline Fletcher. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher has received a BS in biology from Emory University and an MS in botany from the University of Montana, and her PhD in plant pathology from Texas A&M. She is internationally recognized for her research on the mechanisms of virulence and insect transmission of plant pathogenic bacteria, also the relationships between human pathogens and plants, as well as the emerging disciplines of microbial forensics and agricultural biosecurity. And she has held several important roles in her field, including director of the National Institute for Microbial Forensics in Food and Agricultural Biosecurity at Oklahoma State University, as well as a council member and president of the American Phytopathological Society, and a member of the Forum of Microbial Threats at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, to only name a few. Her full bio is in our emails and on the website. So after retirement from OSU, she now serves as a consultant and advocate for agricultural biosecurity and international scientific diplomacy. And it is an honor and a pleasure to be able to host you tonight, Dr. Fletcher. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll now hand over the controls to you.
All right, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. And I want to thank not only Blair Budd for all the help she gave me in preparing for this, and Tonya Nichols as well for the invitation. One of the reasons I'm so pleased to be with you tonight is that the role of plants in a One Health concept has been sort of a passion of mine for a long time. I was first pulled into this endeavor early on in the process by some of the early founders, Tom Monath, Laura Kahn, and Bruce Kaplan. I believe I was the first plant pathologist to sort of engage in the process, and I went to several meetings early on when the groups were discussing what the One Health concept actually is. So it's a real pleasure to come back to it and to speak about it and to actually learn a lot of what's been going on in the past decade plus since I got into it. So I'm going to stop sharing my video so that you can see the screen and hopefully figure out. This is my first time to use this program, so Blair, you'll let me know if the slides aren't showing up properly. But
absolutely, we're seeing your first slide, so great job.
All right, very good. So this title actually is the title of a paper that the founders that I just mentioned, Monath and Kahn and Kaplan, asked me to write for a special edition of Veterinaria Italiana that was published in 2009. And the basics of what I'm going to talk about is from that chapter, but I've updated it with quite a few things that that weren't so obvious when I was writing that paper back then. So beginning with an introduction, I'm going to tell you what you already know. The thing is that the fates of humans and animals are inextricably linked to those of plants. And this is one of the major reasons that you're looking at here. Plants are the only living organisms that have the capacity to be transformers of solar energy. So they are the ones that take that solar energy and convert it into the energy of chemical bonds in molecules and building blocks of life. So plants are absolutely essential, directly and indirectly, for human and animal health. In addition to that, they also provide things that make us more comfortable: fiber for clothing, structural materials for our residences, and so on. But there are tremendous links between the health of plants, animals, and humans, and that's where I'm going to start out. So we've already talked about plants being the transformers of solar energy. Food security, of course, is crucial for the physical and emotional health of humans and animals all over the world. We don't always do so well with that. We still have a lot of hungry people in the world. The FAO estimated more than 1 billion back in 2009. And even with livestock feeding, we struggle with that sometimes following winter storms and drought. I think that they probably are dealing with this still in Texas right now after the storms that we've had over the past week or so. But through history, plant diseases have had significant impacts on human health and sociology. You're probably all aware of the Irish potato famine. Everybody seems to have heard of that, occurring in the mid-1800s due to a fungus disease, the late blight fungus. And that particular outbreak of plant disease, potato disease, led to over 1 million people dying horribly. And even more than that, 1.5 million or so emigrating out of Ireland, many of them coming to the United States. You may not, though, be aware of why the British drink tea. Well, this is also because of a plant disease. Ceylon was a colony of the UK in the late 1800s when the island of Ceylon was struck by a very severe coffee rust. Rust is another fungal disease. Their major market for their coffee was the UK, but when their coffee harvest failed, they turned to another major crop on Ceylon. They grew really good tea there. And that was the point at which many of the British people began to drink tea. But on a more serious note, plant diseases have even affected the movement of troops during wartime. There were critical food losses during World War I in both the US and the UK because of bad weather that was conducive to the development of plant disease. There were hundreds of thousands of bushels of wheat and tons of potatoes that were lost during that time, and it impacted where the troops were sent during that wartime period. So what about today? What about impacts on human health today? Well, in countries like the United States, well-developed countries, wealthy countries, it's unlikely to cause malnutrition or significant food shortages, but that's not necessarily true in all countries. In third world nations, developing nations, we have concerns now with disease like cassava brown streak virus threatening food security in Eastern and Central Africa, where cassava is one of their main staples in their diet. In Southeast Asia, where rice is eaten multiple times a day and comprises the major portion of the diet, rice blast is a potentially very serious threat. And there are many other examples of that type. Another element of relationship between humans and plants in terms of health is food safety, not just food security, but now I'm talking about the existence of these foodborne diseases. Estimated worldwide, about 1.5 million die each year from diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated food and water. A significant and rising fraction of those, particularly in developed countries, are due to fresh produce contamination by human pathogens like E. coli 0157H7, Salmonella, Shigella, Listeria, a number of others. And these are thought to be due to sort of a cycle of, production in livestock, like this cow here. And the livestock, these human pathogens are present in the feces, and from there they contaminate the surfaces of plants that may be growing in that agricultural environment. The cows eat the plants and it goes back and forth. But if humans get into the mix by harvesting the plants, they can be infected by these human pathogens that are residing on those plants. Now, until fairly recently, we thought that the human pathogens on plants were sort of inert. They're just sitting there, idle passengers on your salad, but they're not. We have found, sorry, I keep doing that. We have found that many of them have acquired by horizontal transfer genes for traits that allow them to colonize those surfaces. These are traits having to do with fitness and attachment, formation of biofilms. And in some cases, they don't just colonize the plant surface, but they actually enter into the interior of the plant itself. And the lower picture on the left there is the picture of an open stomata. And these are the air gas exchange structures on plant leaf surfaces. So you can see the bacteria there that are actually caught in the process of moving into that plant tissue. And what they do in there is the subject of a really fascinating area of research right now that is being conducted by both food safety specialists and plant pathologists. And this kind of phenomenon highlights the importance of multidisciplinary approaches to understanding and solving public health problems. Mycotoxins are another area of concern. These are produced by a number of plant pathogenic fungi, and they can be very serious human and animal threats. Mycotoxins are not produced by the plant pathogens in order to make people sick. They actually contribute to the syndrome of the plant disease. They exacerbate the symptoms, and they're often retained in the product that we harvest for food. Mycotoxicoses are often associated with areas where the storage facilities are not optimal. And this happens more frequently in underdeveloped nations than it does in nations like the United States. So they're more of a problem there. They're less frequent in developed nations, except for two areas. One where there's a lot of corn-based food consumption, and also particularly vulnerable foods like peanut products. But not just people can get sick, animals too. There was a case of aflatoxins in peanut meal that was fed to turkeys in the UK, and giving rise to a disease called Turkey X that killed 100,000 birds during that time. So this is another area of direct impact. Also of concern is antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics have been used since the 1950s to control bacterial diseases of certain high-value crops like fruits, vegetables, and ornamental plants. They're not used so often in grains, field crops, because of the vast acreages involved. But despite their use, plant applications actually account for less than 0.5% of total antibiotic use. But still, even though it's small, we have detected antibiotic resistant strains of several plant pathogens, for example, streptomycin resistance, and this has impeded disease management in several important cases. It's interesting that a fraction of those streptomycin-resistant genes that have been found in plant pathogens are similar to those in bacteria isolated from humans and animals, and they have been shown to have transfer proficient elements, so there's a likelihood that they obtain these genes through transfer. Now, USDA and EPA both now limit the use in edible crops, but we do have provisions for emergency use. So these are called Section 18s. There's a Section 18 in place for the use of tetracycline right now in Florida for citrus greening disease, which is devastating the citrus industry in Florida. But there certainly is a growing awareness and attempts to reduce the use of antibiotics. Now I want to switch to just some of the elements of the common basic biology and pathogenicity that we have among pathogens that affect plants and animals and humans. So many things. I think that in general, we're more alike than we are different in terms of some of the molecular aspects of living things, the signaling, the quorum sensing, the receptors, the production of biofilms of these microbes in whatever host they affect. So both plant and animal human pathogens have these sensor molecules that detect environmental signals and translate them via these molecular pathways. These are often coupled with quorum sensing, which is the detection of a minimum population of that particular microbe. And that quorum sensing mechanism is responsible for triggering expression of genes that are otherwise repressed because these pathogens don't need to produce the virulence factors and things like biofilms for attachment and colonization if they're not in that phase yet. Now, pathogen recognition by plant sensors then triggers the host resistance response pathways. So that's a really important element in plant disease resistance. The corollary is that if there's no recognition, then disease can progress because the host resistance response is not activated. Surface appendages like Fimbria and pili are often also virulence related, as well as being involved in conjugation and delivery of molecules directly into the host cell. Secretion systems, another one that's common in both. Many animal, human, and plant pathogens export things like toxins and enzymes and growth regulators, etc. And these secretion systems, some of them are very similar among pathogens. One of the best examples is the type 3 secretion system, which was first described in Yersinia, but it's now known in many zoonotic and plant pathogens. For example, in plants, the products of the type 3 secretion system are recognized by the products of plant host resistance genes, and that's what leads to that activation of host resistance that I mentioned before. Interestingly, the type 3 secretion system genes bear hallmarks of horizontal transfer as well, and they're believed to be fairly readily exchanged among bacteria. Gene regulation also has similarities. The genes involved in host recognition and adherence are often expressed soon after the pathogen and host come into contact. And this is kind of a repeat of what I said a minute ago, that these virulence factors are only activated when the bacteria reach a quorum, therefore allowing them to escape that host resistance response and to achieve a population sufficient for translocation and colonization. So this is an interesting set of diagrams, the ohms, and it's something that all hosts of pathogens have in common. What we're learning about these ohms is so interesting and so relevant to how disease develops and the commonalities between diseases of all of these different hosts. The top picture shows the human microbiome. Of course, we know so much now about this aspect of the communities that occupy the different organs of the body, the skin, the digestive tract, the mouth, the reproductive, or I mean, everything. It's not just associated with disease, it's associated with normal functioning of all these organs. Well, the same is true for plants. There are completely different communities of microbes that inhabit the leaf surface, that inhabit the vascular tissue that transports materials around inside the plant, that inhabit the roots. The roots are really different because they're in the soil, and that's a very, very different environment, or the flowers and so on. Now, in the lower left corner, the diagram that says phytobiomes, that's an area that's really been fairly new in the plant world, started by plant pathologists. And it's the idea that not only do plants have microbiomes, but they have a lot more things in and around them that influence their normal health and their disease states. So things like not just the microbes, they're beneficial microbes in addition to harmful ones, but also animals, the insects that feed on them or that serve as vectors, worms that burrow through the soil, the nutrients, the soils themselves, the climate. All of these things impact the ability of that disease to develop. And then a third concept that I really just learned about in the past couple of days as I was doing research for this talk is the pathobiome. It makes a lot of sense to me, but this is understanding that it's, even if you have identified one particular agent that is primarily associated with a disease, certainly there are other microbes there that influence it as well as other things. So it's really important for us to have a holistic view of humans, animals, and plants, along with everything within and around them, which can lead to new and more effective answers about disease management and food security. Plant pathogens, many of them are transmitted in nature by vectors, similarly to things like malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes in the human realm. So like with human and animal diseases, plant pathogens can be transmitted by insects mechanically. They can be foregut-borne, they can circulate in the insect sometimes, or even multiply in it. There can be a specificity between a pathogen and an insect, or the host and an insect, and these are based on physical or metabolic things like being able to avoid the insect's immune response, or being able to cross over cellular barriers in the insect. It's interesting too that passage through the insect may affect the pathogen's virulence, leading to regulatory changes and the ability to function differently in the second host. Management of insect-borne pathogens often involves vector management. That's similar in the medical or livestock areas as well as in crops. In crops, we can use breeding and genetic engineering. It's fairly common to breed for resistance against these insect vectors. Less so in animals, and not that I know of yet in humans. Now, there also are direct influences of plant pathogens on human and animal health. So there are a number of cross-kingdom pathogens. Insect-borne pathogens actually qualify as cross-kingdom pathogens if they multiply in their vector. In fact, some of them even cause disease in their insect host as well as their primary host. Some of them are believed to have actually started in insects and then took advantage of the fact that the insect was feeding on a plant host to move into that realm. But some plant pathogens actually infect humans. And HPOPs, or these human pathogens on plants, may also be a sort of special category of those pathogens, or maybe not so special, as our research is showing that their interactions with the host plant are remarkable. In some cases, actually triggering resistance responses and other kinds of metabolic reactions in the plant. I found also that Pseudomonas aeruginosa uses a shared subset of virulence factors to affect both plants and mice, suggesting there must be some conserved universal mechanisms of pathogenesis across divergent evolutionary lineages. This is a small sampling of some of the cross-kingdom pathogens that cause disease in both human hosts and plant hosts. You can see on the left the different pathogens there, and the human hosts in the middle and plant hosts on the right. You can see just a variety of things. There's a group of bacteria. There's another list of fungi. In some cases, these are more opportunistic type of pathogens or nosocomial pathogens in one host or the other or both, but not in every case. So this is something that really deserves more investigation. I'm not so sure about viruses. There was an interesting review here, Balik et al., but I feel like the jury's out on whether there truly are viruses that go to both. Other areas of direct impact are where plants or medicine or plant pathogens are the sources of derived medicines. There are over 100 active ingredients derived from plants that are used in drugs and medicines, including vaccines. And I found this really interesting report of a plant pathogen that itself could provide a novel treatment. So Pseudomonas syringae, Pathovar syringae, is a really well-known plant pathogen. It causes leaf spots on beans. It's bacterium. And it produces syringolin. This is in the surfactant class of compounds. And it's produced as a virulence factor because it helps the bacterium inhibit the catalytic activity of eukaryotic proteasomes in the plant host. But other protease inhibitors have been shown to have promise as anti-tumor agents. So there's some interest at looking at this compound. And as we explore plants more, and we have more modern day plant explorers, there may be more examples of things of this type. We can also work to enhance the nutrient value of plant foods. One of the best examples, sort of a classic, is the golden rice, where in countries where food security is not so good, there was a shortage of vitamin B12 in many of the children. This was true in Southeast Asia, and the development of this cultivar of rice that produced vitamin B12 allowed amelioration of that disease in those countries. We also have a number of plant products that are allergenic to a certain proportion of consumers, and we can produce varieties that are allergen-free. We can make bananas that deliver vaccines. And I read that there also are some edible oils that have been so enhanced that physicians actually prescribe them for treatment with certain kinds of syndromes. And besides the nutrient value, we can also enhance the agronomic features of crops, which makes them easier to grow, maybe faster, with less input of pesticides and with less cost to the farmers. So we can produce plants that produce early or late. If they produce early, that can enhance the market. If they're produced later, they can avoid freezing in the spring. We can make them resistant to pathogens and pests, reducing the chemicals and harmful runoff to the environment. We can make them resistant to various environmental threats like salt and heat and drought. I think these aspects are going to become even more important as climate change continues. And we can make them have more uniform growth and quality, which helps with harvest and planting and things like that. Another area of overlap is in biosecurity. And this has been an interest of mine ever since shortly after 9/11, when I kind of got pulled into this area. But all of the sectors of the food chain from farm to fork are vulnerable to pathogens and pests. And we know that from normal infections. Crops have some particular challenges. First, because they're usually grown as monocultures, so all of the plants in the picture you see there have the same genetic identity. Another challenge is that crops are so broadly dispersed, they take up so much acreage in rural and remote areas, and they're very rarely monitored closely by farmers. And for that reason, there can be long lag periods between the time that a pathogen is introduced, the time it's detected, and the time that a response is mounted. And of course, you've all seen the epi curves where the longer you wait, the harder and harder it is to actually do something about a disease. And we have the possibility that plant pathogens could even be used intentionally as bioweapons. Why would someone do this? Well, the plant pathogens have some advantages. They're easily available to those having harmful intent, and they don't hurt the handlers like a human pathogen would. Plant pathogens, we know, were actually part of the biowarfare programs of several countries, including the former USSR and the United States. And when I say they were part of the program, I don't mean that they were ever actually deployed, but they were being studied for their potential in that area. And in fact, there were notes about the use of plant pathogens found in the caves of Afghanistan, particularly wheat rust and rice blast. Motives range from terrorism to economic competition, revenge, and people who want to make some sort of political or social statement. The environmental impacts is another area of kind of concern, particularly with the advance of climate change, leading to all kinds of living things changing their geographical ranges. They move so that they're present in places they never were before, and some places where they were before, they're not anymore because of these changing conditions. So what moves? Well, plants move themselves, the species. I don't mean they get up and walk, but the range changes. But also their pathogens and their insect pests and their vectors. But these things don't all change in the same way, to the same degree, at the same time. So you end up having new combinations of hosts and pathogens and vectors. You also have problems with invasive species that have particularly different kinds of behavior in new climates. And there's growing evidence of climate change increasing the rates of plant hybridization because species that were previously isolated are coming into contact for the first time because of these changes. These kinds of things have both direct and indirect impacts on food security, especially in areas that are drought-stricken, recently Somalia, South Africa, and in areas where the population is poor, or in the tropics where plant-based foods like rice and cassava and potatoes are the primary staples in the diet. And that kind of leads me to the next section of my talk, which is really an interesting area that I really just learned about recently. And it's based on a couple of papers that I found by Danielson in the Netherlands and colleagues of hers. And she called this reaching for low-hanging fruit. And it has to do with delivery of health services at the community level in developing nations primarily. And what they pointed out is that there are poor health among farmers, whether it's due to malnutrition or diseases, HIV, Ebola, even COVID-19, certainly impacts the productions of crops and livestock. If farmers can't go out to the field, either because they're sick or because they're at home taking care of relatives that are sick, then you can have severe impacts. And this did actually happen. I've read cases about Ebola in Africa where crops just were not harvested, they were not tended, and that not only affected the availability of food, but also the economy of those regions. But Danielson pointed out that integrating healthcare services across sectors can actually help improve outcomes, especially in these low-income regions. And one of the examples that she was describing were networks of plant clinics, and these occur all across those developing nations. Some of them state-run, others by institutions such as CABI and others. They're not complicated modern laboratories. They're simple rural stations where the people helping the agricultural people are local ag extension. They're called plant doctors, and they're able to offer actionable plant health advice. That means things that the growers in that region have the resources and enough money if they need it to make these work. This group conducted a survey of 180 plant doctors that worked at these clinics, and in the survey, they found that 81% of those plant doctors had also received queries about animal agriculture, things like tick diseases, tick-borne diseases, worms, and parasites that occurred in their livestock. And if they could answer them, they did. They would try to do that. So Danielson and her colleagues said, well, what would it take to set up joint crop livestock clinics and help people at the same time? And the points that she talked about were realigning existing animal and crop advisory systems, making sure that there are the proper legal and regulatory frameworks, capacity, both technical and operational, managing data, making sure the quality of what's offered is appropriate, and then evaluating the system and making adjustments according to local need, local problems, and resources available. One of the comments she made at the end of one of the papers was that the benefits of such joint health service delivery remains underexplored in One Health. I think this is just one nice example showing how merging of the two sectors can be quite effective. So finally, coming to near the end, some overarching thoughts. You know, my title is that plants are necessary for a balanced One Health concept. But what does that mean? These are some of the many logos that you can find on the internet for One Health, and they all talk about these three parameters: people, animals, and the environment. Now, I know because I was kind of involved early on that One Health began actually as a coalition within the veterinary and medical communities in recognition of the importance of zoonotic diseases and the need for veterinarians and medical personnel to collaborate and cooperate. Makes a lot of sense. And of course, the environment impacts both pathogens and hosts, regardless of the system. just as is shown here. In order to get disease, as you see in the center red shape, you must have a convergence of the susceptible host, the virulent pathogen, and the conducive environment. But funnily, this disease triangle was not created by the One Health movement. It's actually what's in the elementary plant pathology textbooks. This was created by plant pathologists, but it's equally valid for any host pathogen system. So what is the environment part of One Health? Well, I found this paper by ESSAC, I thought was interesting, saying that the environment is the most dynamic and confounding sector of One Health, that it encompasses all these things listed here, all life other than the humans and the animals, the weather, the temperature, the moisture, the climate, and even social and political influences. So this stuff is all in that third part of the One Health circle. But what is a balanced One Health concept? The more we learn about these living systems, regardless of what they are, the more we appreciate how they influence one another in complex and multi-layered ways, how they behave similarly and uniquely, how they're impacted similarly and uniquely by environmental factors, and that scientific research on each of these sectors overlaps and informs the others, and the solutions as well. And finally, that healthy plants are essential for healthy people and healthy animals. So I like this alternate perspective of One Health, where the environmental sector of it is focused on agriculture, because that is so critical for the production of food that makes the health of the other two sectors possible. And I won't go into details because I see our time is getting short. The same article also had this diagram showing the human, animal, and the environment, with plants being a major component here, and not just all of the other factors. But this shows that the impacts of all of these impactors, population growth, climate change, environmental toxins, etc., at the national level, the state level, the regional level, and the local level. And I think that this is kind of a way to look at it going forward, and merging these three different sectors: the plants, the animals, and the humans. This slide is just to say that in this wonderful National Academy of Sciences series of panels that's going to start tomorrow, systematizing the One Health approach in preparedness and response for infectious disease outbreaks. I looked at the agenda, and it is mostly human and animal diseases. But in this one panel on Wednesday, David Rizzo is a plant pathologist. He's the chair of the plant pathology department at UC Davis, and he was quite instrumental in the development of the One Health Institute at UC Davis. So if you're interested in the plant's role in One Health, I'm expecting that he's going to have some interesting things to say that probably go well beyond what I've said tonight. And that's my last slide. So Blair, I think I've taken up more time than I thought I would. So do we have time for questions?
For sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for such a lovely presentation. I'm monitoring the questions, so thank you guys for your patience, and we'll go ahead and get started with this now. But I would like to say thank you so much for your time, that great information. And normally, if we were in person hosting you, I would at this point in time pass you a flag that has been flown over the Capitol as a token of our gratitude, because those are located in downtown DC and we are not in person. I'm sorry that I'm not able to do that, but I'd be happy to get your forwarding address to send that to you if you would like it. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to go ahead and segue to questions. So let me go ahead and start with our first one. Are there any mRNA vaccines being used against any plant pathogens?
Um, I assume that the question is, are they being used in plants? Um, I know there is research on mRNA activity and in plants, whether you would call it a vaccine, I'm not sure, but maybe that language is appropriate.
All
I don't
right,
know much about it, so I'll have to pass on details.
got it. Thank you. All right, our next question is the fact that contaminants such as bacteria from animal feces can actually be found inside a plant and not just on its surface is enlightening. What can we do as ordinary people that do not typically manage farms where these plants or farm animals are? What can we do to help prevent this?
That's a really interesting question. When this was discovered was not too long after the severe outbreak of E. coli 0157H7 on spinach that was later found associated with feral pigs moving into crops. And one of the things that they were struggling with at that time is that you didn't seem to be able to wash off these contaminated plants. And we believe now that, that has partly to do with the fact that some of them have internalized. I believe it also has to do with the fact that they form biofilms on the leaf surfaces. So that also makes them very hard to wash off. So I think the main way of approaching that or managing it is by managing it on the farm and in the other areas where contamination may occur, which could be in packing houses, storage facilities, and so on. So choose wisely where you buy your fresh vegetables.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is it says, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to follow up on antibiotics and plant diseases. In January 2021, EPA expanded the registration to allow for the use of streptomycin on all types of citrus to combat citrus greening slash HLB through 2028, with the potential for the use of this antibiotic to be drastically increased. Are there potential biosecurity issues to agriculture and humans? And if so, what would be most likely or what types of outcomes could we anticipate?
I wasn't aware that about the streptomycin, so that's interesting to know. Um, it's a balancing act between um, the needs of the grower community, the economy of the entire state of Florida. Um, the disease there is extremely advanced. It's pretty much everywhere in Florida. And so they're at a point now where they're really trying to save an industry. So yes, the downside is that anytime you have a use of antibiotics like streptomycin in agriculture, there is a chance for resistance to develop. So I am assuming, I feel fairly confident that they will be accompanying this permission with monitoring for these resistant strains and hopefully managing it in some way that way.
Okay, thank you. Um, the next question says, CC is causing asyncrasy between plant flowering times and insect emergence. How is this affecting pollination of those crops that rely on animal pollination? Climate change, sorry, I assume it's CC.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Could you sort of read that
Oh
again? Because
yeah, sorry, I had to process that too. Apologies, Terry. Climate change is causing asyncrasy between
oh
plant
yeah,
flowering times and insect emergence. So how is this affecting the pollination of those crops that rely on animal pollination?
that's a great question. I don't have the answer, but I feel confident that ecologists and population biologists are looking into questions of that sort. That's just one of many potential impacts. We think about a similar thing that comes to my mind is that you may not have the vectors of a plant disease agent migrating in the same way that the plants do. So now you may not have a disease because the vector didn't go there because it's out of its range, but maybe you have new vectors in that location. So you have these new associations forming and new relationships. So that's kind of a similar thing to the pollinators. Maybe there would be other pollinators in that area that could take over that role. Or maybe the plants wouldn't survive well in that area because they didn't have pollinators. So these are all things that we really need to monitor.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next question is, what would it take to set up joint plant, animal, and human clinics?
Well, that one paper that I showed, and I had the reference on that slide, talked about that, what would be necessary. And they had several suggestions. Maybe I could go back to that. Let me see. Okay, are you seeing that slide?
Yes, delivery of health services.
Yeah, so this is kind of what your question was. What would it take? And these are some of the elements that would have to be present. I think it would take strong will on the parts of state agencies in the nations that are involved, and or organizations like CABI, which has networks worldwide, maybe the WHO or the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. I think it would take some support and encouragement from, and maybe incentives to do this sort of thing. But I think that once it is established, I mean, the plant clinics are already working pretty well. So it seems to me that there's a fairly good chance that this could also be a beneficial approach. Money, of course, they need money too.
Thank you for going to that slide. I'll move on to the next question. In indigenous knowledge in Mesoamerica, there is a concept of a healthy environment directly correlated to avoiding zoonoses. For example, Corona SPP in local bats not passing to humans if all plant foods found in a healthy ecosystem remain available. Is there any research on how plant products digested by wildlife may contain prevention mechanisms so animals keep these under control?
Wow, what an interesting question. I am not aware of any research along those lines, but it would be really interesting. I mean, this is just vaguely related, sort of on the edges, but one thing I do know is about insect vectors that feed on plants, and they actually can be impacted in significant ways. They can change their breeding behavior. They can change their resistance to things like cold, harsh winters, things like that. So it's definitely clear that plant products or the consumption of plants can change behaviors and ability to withstand challenges. So I think it'd be a really interesting area to learn more about.
Thank you. Okay, we have 5 minutes left and we've got 2 more questions. So thank you guys for all of this engagement. Now our next question is, thank you for a great talk. Are there cross-kingdom pathogens that infect humans, animals, and plants? In your slide, you just list humans and plants.
Okay, let me go back to that. I think there were some of those that also affected animals as well as humans. Okay, so for example, Serratia marcescens, oops, yep. I happen to know about that one because I worked on this. I was the one who actually showed that Serratia marcescens was the causal agent of cucurbit yellow vine decline disease. And I know that Serratia marcescens affects animals, insects, people, and plants. So that's one example for sure. Um, not being a medical person, I'm not as, or a veterinarian, I'm not as sure as of the other, but I imagine there must be others here. I bet some of the audience members know more than I do.
Understand. Sorry for folks, we aren't able to do a unmute situation, so I
Yeah.
appreciate the engagement over the questions, and thank you, Dr. Fletcher. All right, I'll move on to our final question, which is, do aquatic plants and their culture play a role in One Health approach? In a One Health approach? Any examples?
I have not read anything about that, but I cannot imagine why they would not be, both because they are one of the biggest uh, photosynthesizing resource that we have, particularly in the oceans, for wildlife in the oceans and so forth. And because algae are so much in under study right now for food production and energy production. So algae are mined for biofuels, and there's really growing interest in raising them as a food source for many reasons. They wouldn't have to be grown outdoors in vast acreages. They would be under more controlled conditions. You could control the inputs and the outputs a lot better. And it could offer a number of advantages. So I would see algae as being really important in this concept.
All right. Um, and just other comments and the questions have just been, thank you, this was wonderful, and let's do research about this. So I appreciate the positivity, and thank you for the feedback, everyone. We'll wrap it up as close to on time as we can. So thank you so much again, Dr. Fletcher, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know your time is finite, and the computer time especially is a challenge in this day and age to spend more time on the computer than normal. So thank you for sharing your evening with us. We so appreciate all the engagement, all the questions, and really just hope everyone's hanging in there and continue to do all we can to push the One Health message forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for helping us understand one important sector that sometimes doesn't get a lot of recognition. So we're grateful for your time, information, and energy, and really thank you so much.
Did you put my email in
Oh
the
yes,
chat?
I can add that. Thank you for the reminder. I'm going to thank you, Dr. Fletcher. For folks that would like to have more information or reach out to Dr. Fletcher following the presentation, I am going to add her email to the chat function. So you have that, and she's been gracious enough to allow us to share this, so you can speak with her following the talk or provide any sort of feedback. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. That is available for the entire audience, so you guys all have it. Yes, thank you for the reminder, and I hope everyone stays healthy and safe, and we look forward to seeing you soon. We'll follow up with our next speaker series, so stay tuned on email and online, and thank you guys, and again, Dr. Fletcher, really fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Good night,
Thanks, guys.
everybody.
Good night.